Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. I wanted to touch base real quick before we start our new learning module on whether or not gifted education is a right or a privilege this week. So a few topics that I would like to talk through as I'm grading some of your papers and looking through the previous discussion board posts. I wanted to talk about the difference between ability grouping and tracking. So tracking has a pretty negative connotation in education, and I would agree. I like to think about tracking like a train track. So actually, you may be able to see I live right outside of the Charlotte Light Rail, so I literally look outside and I see the train track. And it only has the ability to stay on the track. So it's not as if the light rail can decide, I'm going to jump over here to this other track. It's not possible. And that's a really good visual image when you're thinking about tracking in education. So if we think you are on the Honors English track, then you start in Honors English 1, then you do Honors English 2, and Honors English 3, and Honors English 4. So it follows a track, and usually it's possible, but it's difficult to jump into that track if you don't start on the honors track. So honors tracking, or any kind of tracking, often has a negative connotation because it does put these students in routes that are hard to shift in between. In terms of grouping, one of the best practices in terms of all education, and particularly gifted education, is what we call flexible grouping. So grouping should always be changing. With differentiation, multiple things are happening at one time, and it's different every week, every day sometimes. So the question on that survey that we took way back at the start of the semester that always seems to surprise everyone is how it's very beneficial for gifted students to be grouped together. So within the College of Education, you are told over and over again to have heterogeneous groups. Oftentimes what this looks like is highly gifted students are placed with students who may be struggling and asked to help them understand the material, which typically turns into the gifted student teaching the material. And as we've talked about, that can grow to be quite boring to the gifted student, oftentimes leads to underachievement because they already know the material. They don't need extra practice in teaching it. They've already got it. So it is important cognitively to group gifted students by ability. It's also important emotionally because we've talked about having these same intellectual peers, and having their intellectual peers is important because these students can have conversations and understand each other. But one kind of caveat that I think we often forget about is we can still have heterogeneous groups within gifted students. So just because we're placing all of the gifted students together, that doesn't mean they're four of the same students. So, for example, this is my assistant. Maslow, you haven't shown up in a while. All gifted, sorry guys. If you have a group of, let's say, 4 students who are gifted, those 4 students are going to have their own unique strengths and their own unique interests and their own unique needs. So just because we are grouping by ability doesn't mean that the group all of a sudden becomes the same and homogeneous. So we still have a lot of heterogeneous grouping occurring within the gifted students. My favorite example of this is if we're doing independent research projects, those students are always doing different topics. They all have different interests. So I'm placing them in groups for peer editing. They all have been identified as gifted, so they have pretty similar writing and analytical skills, but they have different interests, so it's still heterogeneous in that way, and they're able to learn from one another. So I just wanted to make sure that we ironed out that difference between tracking and between ability grouping, and that we don't make the assumption that just because we are grouping by ability, we're losing the diversity, because that diversity of interest and ability and even thinking and cognitive style is what's so important about heterogeneous grouping. So I did want to point that out. One other caveat that came from reading your myths and realities reflection relates to the item about identifying and labeling students as gifted. So a couple of you, I was very impressed, reflected on that and said, well, it kind of contradicts what we've talked about in other courses about ability and effort praise. So if you know the work of Carol Dweck and the importance of having a growth mindset, we preach to our education students that we always tell students, you're doing such a great job, you've worked really hard. We give them what's called effort praise rather than saying, you're really smart. So when we label students as gifted, it's important that we pair that label with effort praise. So there are some people who think, oh, we shouldn't call individuals gifted because that's going to promote a fixed mindset. Well, actually, calling students gifted can be really helpful because of all of the social and emotional issues that go along with the cognitive abilities that we associate with giftedness. So as you watched in that child documentary about what it's like to grow up gifted, these students feel really different. They don't feel the same as their peers. They don't feel like they belong. And having a label and saying, you're gifted helps them see I am different and it's legitimate. There's a reason I'm different and I'm not just making it up. I'm not weird. I'm gifted. Okay, so we don't just say you're gifted. We then pair that with the appropriate effort praise that we're always talking about in your College of Education courses. So I was impressed that several of you brought that up, and I wanted to make sure I reiterated that. So we don't just stop and say you're gifted. We're also pairing that with effort praise. It's even more important to give effort praise to gifted students than those who are not identified as gifted, because at some point, no matter how gifted you are, you will reach a challenge that you can't just do. And if you've been told over and over again, you're gifted and nothing else about your effort, then that's really going to freak you out and you won't be able to reach your full potential. So great job bringing up those points. I know I'm a little behind in grading. I had a writing deadline. So I'm catching up a little bit and I will get your grades to you as soon as possible. I've had some of you emailing me particular questions. I welcome that. I've enjoyed hearing some of your personal experiences working with the gifted. So you guys are doing a wonderful job. Just to briefly introduce this week's case study, I will say from the start, I think this is the hardest learning module, mainly because it's really, really hard to swallow the truth about what gifted students, quote, deserve according to the law. So this week we are looking at what legally is promised to students who are identified as gifted. What you will quickly see is that giftedness changes from district to district, definitely from state to state, sometimes, guys, school to school. So serving the gifted and talented is a big challenge. This week, your case study is about a pretty well-off family who has 2 children who have been identified as gifted, and this family has the opportunity to send their children to an alternative school for the gifted. It's called Helios. It's an actual school. You can look it up, and it is a project-based school. So the case study asks you to consider, do all students who are identified as gifted, according to the law, do they all deserve this same opportunity as this family's children had? So what I want you to do this week is separate, and I know this is hard, separate your mind from your heart. This first week of the learning module, I want you to dig into the contents of the library, read these materials carefully, watch these videos. There's some more jargon in here in terms of law, because it's looking at what does the federal government promise to students who are identified as gifted and talented. By law, what can they receive? What are we required to give them? So after reading the case study, the discussion post this week is separated into 2 main questions, so make sure you address both of these. The first is, do all students in this country, by law, deserve the same services as the students in this case study. So that's number one. Do all students deserve these same services? And the second is, who is responsible for providing the services for gifted and talented students? Whose job is it to make sure that we are serving them? So this week, it's all about your brain, guys. I want you to look deeply into the content, read through some of this law, look at what are we really allowed to, or not allowed to do, what are we required to do by law. You will be surprised. Federally, there is no guarantee that we serve gifted students. It is left up to the states. Okay, so it becomes very complicated if you consider students who are moving, like a military family. I've done some consulting with DODEA schools, which are the military schools. Their gifted education program is a mess because as you move from one state to the next, the definition of giftedness could even change. So you could be gifted in Nebraska, but not gifted in California. And think about how that would impact the student socially and emotionally. So this week is all about, from your library content, what is promised by law to students who are identified as gifted and talented. I know it's hard to separate your head from your heart, but that is the challenge. And rest assured, because next week, and I'll introduce this again on our next video, but next week we will focus on your own personal belief. So you will have the ability to speak your truth and say all of the things that make you mad and all of the things that we want to make sure as educators we are providing for our students. But for this week in the content, I want you to focus really heavily on being able to back everything you say up with one of your sources. Okay? So as always, your initial discussion post will be due Friday and your responses will be due on Sunday. Please remember that I'm here to answer any questions, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.